Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. With any luck, you're having an amazing day. We're going to be kicking this video off with news from AMD. Specifically, this revolves around the company's plans for future CPUs. Some of this information is an exclusive from several of my sources, so if you prefer to read the information, that was a terrible sentence, but if you prefer to read this, it's available as an article which is linked in the description of this very video. So a couple of days ago, I broke the news that AMD were pursuing a drastic increase in floating point performance. I had reported that we would be seeing up to around 50% IPC gains for floating point performance. Now obviously that is not necessarily something that's going to benefit us heavily if you do something like gaming, but something like scientific workloads, HPC, that is definitely going to be a major positive for those workloads. For integer performance though, I had said that I'd been hearing around 8% at least. Well, according to a couple of my sources, I've reached out to two sources and both have told me identical. We're actually looking at least 10% for integer operations. So to clarify, for integer type of operations, 10%. For floating point operations, it could be up to 50% improvement in performance for Zen 3. However, if you have an application which heavily utilizes both sets of operations, it's said that it's roughly around 17% IPC gains for the Zen 3 architecture. That is quite monstrous, and also, of course, is kind of what AMD themselves have hinted. They said that the IPC gains for Zen 3 were going to be right in line with what you would expect from a next-generation architecture. And obviously, they are not disappointing here. That is absolutely, well, basically hitting the nail on the head. Now, clock frequency has been another rumour that has been floating around for a while. You might recall, if you're a longer time viewer, that several of my sources have told me 1 to 200 megahertz additional clock frequency. That same frequency gain has also been floating around a couple of Chinese forums as well. Well, another one of my sources reached out to me because I was asking them in light of an interview that's been recently put on Tom's Hardware, I'll get to that in just a moment, regarding the clock frequency, and he said that this is engineering sample of the Milan processors. One of my sources has told me that while it's not impossible for the Ryzen 4000 series processors to reach 200 MHz additional clock frequency like we're seeing with Milan, which once again I remind you are the server processors, EPYC, it may not happen. And there are a couple of reasons behind this, but for one of them, as we get closer to the edge of a frequency curve, it's difficult to just keep increasing that clock frequency. And this is particularly true because we don't necessarily know some of the changes, some of the architectural changes that's happening for the Zen 3 processor architecture. We know that there are numerous changes to the architecture that have not been documented, and that my sources have either not felt comfortable telling me yet, which I completely understand, or that they're not privy to. So because of that, we may not see those additional megahertz make their way down to the Ryzen 4000 series. Also, something else to take into consideration, generally speaking, the Zen processor cores which find their way into the Ryzen processors typically are inferior quality. They generally cherry pick the very best silicon for EPYC for obvious reasons. This isn't to say that it's not going to happen with the additional clock frequency, but basically I would just taper your expectations. Someone else has told me that we may see certain very limited production chips which hit higher clock frequency, but the messaging is kind of mixed here, so if I were you, I would go into this thinking that the clock frequency for Ryzen 4000 is going to be very much similar to what we're seeing already. Basically, don't think 5 GHz for Ryzen 4000. Now, something else I really want to bring your attention to is regarding core count. This is going to be a mixture of some information that I've been fed from some sources, but also a rather fascinating interview with Mark Papermaster. It has been on Tom's Hardware, so I'll give that a link in the video description. Yes, that was an awful sentence. But anyway, I don't see the mainstream space with any imminent barrier, and here's why. It's just catch-up time for the software to leverage the multi-core approach. But we're over that hurdle now, and more applications take advantage of multi-core and multi-threading. In the near term, I don't see a saturation point. You have to just be very thoughtful when you add cores. You don't want to just add it before the application can take advantage of it. As long as you keep that balance, I think we'll continue to see that trend, end quote. Now, one of the earlier rumours I had for Ryzen 4000 was that we would not see additional CPU cores for that particular series. But given what Mark Papermaster here has said, I decided to reach out to a couple of my sources and ask them what they've heard. And they basically said much the same as earlier. The core counts for Ryzen 4000 are said to remain consistent. So we're going to see IPC enhancements and blah, maybe some clock frequency bumps, but we won't see additional number of cores. And this is because of multiple reasons, but one of them is platform limitations. So obviously the fact that you're still using DDR4 to feed the processor cores means that bandwidth could certainly be a big problem. I was told though that Ryzen 5000, which would obviously be utilising the Zen 4 architecture, could potentially be very different. And I was also told that the socket for this platform would be named AM5. The core counts though for Ryzen 5000 are not finalised by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the processors themselves, that is Zen 4, is still under development, so core counts are just not only a matter of the technical ability of AMD, but also market conditions as well. To clarify what I mean by market conditions, basically what they feel they would need to compete and outperform Intel. So it's going to be really dependent upon what Intel can hit AMD back with over the next couple of years. And the last thing that I'd like to bring to your attention is SMT4. So SMT4 has been one of those persistent rumours for the Zen processor architecture. In fact, it was heavily rumoured for Zen 3, but of course we quickly learnt that this wasn't the case when AMD themselves accidentally did an oopsie and put a roadmap out that they shouldn't. In general, you have to look at simultaneous multi-threading, SMT, says Mark Papermaster in the same Tom's Hardware interview. There are applications that can benefit from it and there are applications which can't. Look at the PC space today. Many people actually don't enable SMT. Many people do. SMT4, clearly, there are some workloads which benefit from it, and there are many others that wouldn't even be deployed. It's been around in the industry for a while. It's not a new technology concept at all. It's been deployed in servers. Certain server vendors have had it for some time. It's really just a matter of certain workloads can take advantage of it. End quote. Now, my sources have told me that they've not heard of a specific architecture from AMD which will provide SMT4. And I was also told, once again, although we kind of knew this anyway, that SMT4 is definitely not a part of Zen 3, so it's not like a super secret thing that AMD are kind of keeping tucked away. But I was told that AMD are internally experimenting with SMT4, but that doesn't really come as a surprise to me. And to be honest with you, if you really examine Mark Papermaster's answers, he's essentially saying that, yeah, some workloads can benefit from it, which we kind of knew. He's pretty much saying that it's really only advantageous for certain workloads, generally servers. So even if AMD were to bring SMT4 to, let's say, the Zen 4 architecture, and no, that's not something a source has told me, I'm just using it as an example, I want to be very clear here, but let's just say Zen 4 did feature SMT4, it probably still wouldn't make its way down to the Ryzen series of processors. It's probably going to remain in the realms exclusively for servers and high-performance computing. It's pretty common before a next-generation console launches to see an awful lot of rumours, many of which conflict with the previous rumours. Well, things are no different here. One of the earliest rumours regarding Microsoft's plans for the next generation Xbox is that we would see two distinct SKUs. One is codenamed Anaconda. This is the higher performance SKU and would be aiming to run games at 4K, 60 FPS, have ray tracing support, blah blah. The second system is codenamed Lockhart. And while it's based on the same technology, so from what we gather anyway, it's still using the RDNA-based GPU from AMD. We still have a Zen 2-based CPU, but the performance of this console is considerably less. However, the rumours and the reports were that there were, well, basically a lot of developers that were giving feedback to Microsoft that this was a lot of work, and Microsoft themselves decided that instead of launching a couple of different consoles, it's better just to focus on a single system. And there were also some hints that we would see maybe for them. The rumour was that Lockhart would be based on similar technology to Anaconda. In other words, we would still see an RDNA-based GPU, a Zen-based CPU, and so on and so on. But the clock frequency, or if we're talking about the GPU, the number of shaders would be drastically reduced. Basically, this would be Microsoft's way of getting its foot into your living room, and naturally would be considerably cheaper to boot. It was also said that it would put a much greater emphasis on streaming games as well. There were some conflicting reports of whether the system would be able to play games locally, although it was generally accepted that it could play games locally, but for maximum quality you would need to stream a title from the cloud. Anyway, according to Jason Schreier over at Kotaku, Lockhart is still working. According to developers who have been speaking to him, obviously anonymously, Lockhart is roughly comparable to the PlayStation 4 in terms of performance, and developers are expected to target 1440p and 60 FPS. Meanwhile, Anaconda will target a full 4K 60 FPS. Lockhart will still have many of the benefits of the current generation console. It will still have a new processor and will also sport a solid-state drive. It's very interesting that they say that Lockhart is very comparable to the PlayStation 4 Pro. I'm going to make the assumption that that would be in terms of GPU performance, not CPU performance, which basically means that this console would be the equivalent of around 4.2 T-flops and targeting 1440p. This would put the Anaconda at around the 10 to 12 T-flop range. Of course, given we're dealing with RDNA and not GCN architectures, T-flops are a little more hard to exactly pin down because RDNA is considerably more efficient. It's very interesting though that Microsoft are still pushing Lockhart, because from what the report is here, developers are basically required to target Lockhart when they're developing a game. In other words, they can't just be like, nope, we only want to launch for Anaconda. They have to develop their title for both systems. So it's a little bit like now, when a developer creates a game, they can't just target, let's say, the Xbox One X or the PlayStation 4 Pro. They also need to target the base machine. Anyway, with any luck, you've enjoyed the video. If you did, then definitely leave a like on it, and of course, share it with your friends on your social media platform of choice. And I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.